All right. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us at the first workshop for the 2021 Epistemic Diversity Workshop Series. I'm Arains Palayo, a PhD candidate at UIC, core organizer of this workshop series, and moderator for today's first workshop session. The theme for this first workshop is what is epistemic diversity? And our speakers today are Professor Daniel Steele and Dr. Sina Fazlpour. And they'll be walking us through some key parts of this main question slash theme. Yeah, we'll have our first break at like 4:15. It's a 5-minute break, and then we'll have the following speaker after that. So before I introduce our first speaker today, I'm going to ask that you guys please type your questions into the chat, preferably toward the end of the talk. And I will be addressing the questions through the chat, and then the speaker will follow up on that. Okay, so our first speaker today is Professor Daniel Steele. Currently, he is a professor at the University of British Columbia with appointments in the philosophy department, as well as the School of Population and Public Health. His research focuses on ethical epistemic issues in science, particularly in relation to environmental and public health issues. Professor Steele is the author of several books and articles published in the leading presses and journals. His most recent book, published with Cambridge University Press, is titled Philosophy and the Precautionary Principle, Science, Evidence, and Environmental Policy. He is going to give us a talk titled Multiple Diversity Concepts and Their Ethical Epistemic Implications. Please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Steele.
All right, thank you. So I'm gonna share screen and get my slides up. And great, so it looks like everything's good there. All right, so yes, I'm going to talk about different concepts of diversity, and I'm going to begin just by noting this research was funded by a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Canada, Council of Canada, a grant that ran from 2017 to 2020. And this paper that I'm going to present is published in 2018 in the European Journal for Philosophy of Science. It's published open access, so anybody can see it. Great, so this project was really inspired by an observation that diversity can mean a lot of different things. And I want to begin by pointing out that there's an obvious and less obvious way that people can notice this. So the obvious way is to notice that there are many different attributes that are relevant to diversity. You can think about gender diversity, ethnic diversity, theoretical diversity. At a somewhat more abstract level, you can think about demographic versus cognitive diversity. And I think it's obvious that pretty much everybody who works or thinks about diversity, that there are different sort of domains or contexts in which you could talk about diversity. The less obvious aspect of different ways of thinking about diversity is that even if you kept a certain attribute, let's say like gender or ethnicity, constant, there could still be different concepts of diversity. And that's the idea I'm going to talk about today. And this is important, I think, because many researchers, and especially philosophers who've written about diversity in science, seem largely, at least prior to our own work on this, largely unaware of this non-obvious point. So I'm going to begin with an example that sort of inspired this idea. And so this relates to something called Vaisakhi, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with, but this is a harvest and New Year festival from the Punjab region, and it's celebrated by members of the Sikh religion. And there are large, or well, not in 2020, but in most years, large Vaisakhi parades held annually in Vancouver and the neighboring city of Surrey. And it so happened to me that in 2016, I happened to sort of stumble upon and participate sort of by accident, or attend by accident, one of these in Vancouver when I was bringing my kids to Chinese school, and was late for Chinese school because of the traffic jam caused by this parade. And I let my daughter play hooky from Chinese school for about a half an hour, and we went to go and just attend the parade and see and observe it. And so when I brought my daughter back to Chinese school, and I was thinking about diversity in science, and I started thinking, wow, this is a really diverse event. And I thought, but is it really diverse? And I realized that you could answer yes or no to the question, is this a diverse event, depending on how you thought about diversity. So I think the reaction I initially had was, yes, it's diverse, because most of the people there are not Christian. They're not sort of they diverge in some way from what's the norm in Canada. On the other hand, you could say this event isn't very diverse because almost all the attendees are of the same religion. So in that sense, they're homogeneous, not diverse. And once I realized you could start thinking of ways in which they might be diverse or not diverse, you could come up with even further ways of thinking about it. You could think, yes, maybe it's diverse because the major sects of Sikhism are proportionally represented in this event. So these three answers correspond to three different diversity concepts. And really explaining these and explaining their connections to different ethical and epistemic views about diversity will be the main point of this presentation. So one of these concepts is egalitarian, the idea that a group is diverse to the extent that all attribute categories are present in equal proportions. In that sense, the Vaisakhi parade is not diverse if the relevant attribute is religious affiliation, because almost everybody there is of the same religion. Normic diversity is the idea that diverse means that this group in some way diverges from what's the non-diverse norm in the society. And that's the sense in which the Vaisakhi parade is diverse if you're thinking of the non-diverse norm being Christian, like within Canada. And finally, representative diversity means sort of matching a distribution of the relevant attributes in some reference population. And that was the idea in the third answer to this question. Okay, so the key insight here that was really driving this project was that different diversity concepts tend to be associated with distinct moral and epistemic explanations about why diversity is valuable. And that's going to be the key idea I'm going to try to develop today. So I'm going to begin talking about previous work on diversity concepts, and then I'll go through the rest of this outline. Okay, so I want to begin with just clarifying a few terms I'll use. So I want to distinguish between concepts, contexts, and measures of diversity. So a context of diversity, this is when you're talking about a particular attribute that's relevant to assessing diversity that arises in a particular context. So for instance, if you're talking about gender diversity, because sexism, let's say, is an important issue in a particular context, then that's sort of like the context. There can also be other factors related here to the context, such as judgments about how similar different groups are to one another can also be relevant, but I'll be talking about that less. A concept of diversity, by contrast, as I use that term, is an understanding of what constitutes diversity abstracted from questions about which attributes are relevant to diversity in a specific context. So this is a concept of something that could be applied to a number of different contexts rather, where different attributes such as gender or ethnicity or what have you are relevant. Finally, a measure of diversity is just a mathematical formula for assessing the degree to which some group is or is not diverse. And so these will be, when I talk about concepts of diversity, which is the main focus here, this is what I mean by it. Okay. All right. So I'm beginning with some of the earliest work on this question of concepts of diversity that I know of. And the earliest work on this that I know comes from social science, and it really comes from people thinking about how can they measure diversity. And if you're going to come up with if you're going to empirically study diversity, then clearly you have to be able to measure it. And to measure it, you need to come up with a measure. And to do that, you need to think about what's the theoretical construct that you're measuring. And so this is where you find, at least that I've been able to find, the sort of earliest discussions of concepts of diversity. So here's a quote from a paper by someone named Jay Teachman from 1980. And he says he's introducing this concept that he calls population diversity, which he defines as the distribution of population elements, which are not limited to humans or the characteristics of humans, along a continuum of homogeneity to heterogeneity with respect to one or more variables. So a few things to note about this. First, this is a diversity concept. So it's clearly abstracting from particular context, but at the same time, it's not a mathematical formula for measuring diversity. Secondly, it implies that diversity depends only on the distribution of attributes within the focal group. And so that shows that even though this is a fairly general sounding definition, it's one that actually is going to diverge and differ in certain ways in some of the concepts we'll talk about. Secondly, the label population diversity rather than simply diversity suggests there might be other types of diversity. Okay, so Teachman went on to describe in sort of more detail the particular diversity concept that he wanted to sort of represent mathematically. And I'll say a bit more about that in a sec, but to do that, it will be helpful just to introduce a few terms that I'll use throughout in describing these concepts. So one is the notion of a focal group. So the focal group is just the group whose diversity you're interested in, asking how diverse it is. And I'll just use capital letter G's, sometimes with a G prime, just to refer to focal groups. The next thing are attributes. So that when I use the term attributes, I'm just referring to a type of feature that's relevant to diversity, like gender, ethnicity, discipline, etc. And so I'll represent those by capital A's, and sometimes I'll have an equals with this little sign. And these would be the lowercase a's with the subscripted numbers would be the categories. So for example, in the case of religious affiliation, A would just be religion, and then you'd have specific religions like Christianity, Islam, and so on that a person might subscribe to. Okay, so with that, let's look at Teachman's desirable properties. And these were properties he suggested would be desirable for a measure of diversity, but I think they can also just be taken to articulate a particular concept of diversity. So the first property was that diversity is minimized when everyone or everything falls into the same category. So, if you're talking about gender diversity, if everybody's of the same gender in this group, then that's the minimum amount of diversity you could have. On the other hand, diversity is maximized when you've sort of got all the categories present in this group, and they're all represented in equal proportions. So that will be the maximum of diversity. And the third property was that if you have two groups and the proportions of the individuals in the groups of the categories are equal in both groups, but one of them has more groups represented than the other, the group that has more represented is more diverse. So for example, in the example of religious affiliation, if you had a group that was say equal proportions Christians and equal proportion of Muslims, and another group that was equal proportions Christians, Muslims, and Jews, then that latter group with three different religions present would be the more diverse one. And so I take these criteria basically to identify what we call an egalitarian concept. Egalitarian concept of diversity, and so that's going to be one of the main concepts of diversity we talk about. And I think in the context of social science research, it's just far and away the most commonly one used. And there are a number of different measures that can be used to mathematically measure this concept. But in social science literature on diversity measures, you actually find other concepts suggested as well. So there's a paper by Harrison and Klein from 2007 that discusses a number of different measures and concepts of diversity, which they call variety, which is just the same as what we call egalitarian. And then he suggests two others, separation and disparity. I'm not going to go into these in much detail, but I just raised them to point out that the idea that there are multiple concepts or in ways of thinking about diversity is something that's noted in social science literature on this topic. Another place where you find people explicitly talking about different concepts of diversity is in work on biodiversity. And this is interesting because in some ways, attempts to measure biodiversity, a number of those began by adopting the same measures that were developed in social science for measuring diversity among groups of people. And so since the most commonly used diversity concept there is egalitarian, and the measures were of egalitarian diversity, that was one of the measures that was sort of carried over into biodiversity. And this led to discussions about whether the egalitarian diversity concept was really an appropriate concept for ecology. And it also led to a number of really interesting discussions about ways in which, for example, the concept of diversity and of biodiversity should really depend not only on the site that you're looking at, but on other sites. So for example, if you have an island that's got species that are just not found anywhere else, the fact that the species on this island are very rare in comparison to other sites is something that would make that more diverse. And in addition, there were discussions about the idea that not only does the distribution, either within your sort of focal focal group or within some sort of reference population matter to thinking about diversity, but also features that are not really related to distribution at all, but are really related to something like nativeness, like is this a native species? And that native species would be more diverse than, say, invasive species. And so if we sum up this background literature, there's a number of things that are all very relevant to thinking about diversity in science and other sort of academic pursuits. And that is, number one, there are multiple diversity concepts. Again, remembering these are not, these are concepts that abstract from the context and particular attributes. Second, some depend only on the distribution within the focal group. Others depend on a comparison with the reference population, which was something that came up in biodiversity. That these concepts may or may not include a similarity weighting. That wasn't something I talked about so much, but that was something that was involved in two of the concepts of diversity proposed by Harrison and Klein. And also, finally, and this is something we'll come back to, that some concepts of diversity depend on non-distributional considerations like nativeness. And so one of the things we're going to see is that all of these conceptual complexities also arise in discussions of diversity among scientists and in general in discussion of diversity among people, even though this is something I think in the philosophical literature previously people just hadn't seemed to be aware of. Okay, so back to the outline. Next step, so I'm going to discuss the egalitarian, normic, and representative concepts of diversity in more detail and give examples to illustrate each one and discuss some of their differences. So egalitarian, we've discussed this already. To put in simple terms, the idea is that a group is diverse in the egalitarian sense to the extent of the distribution in G over the relevant attribute. And for simplicity, I'm just assuming there's just one relevant attribute here, is uniform. So for example, if the attribute is religious affiliation, and say these are the religious categories, different religions, then in the Vaisakhi parade example, this would not be very diverse from an egalitarian sense because almost all the participants in that event belong to the same category. Representative diversity. So here the idea is that if we let A be the relevant attribute, say religious affiliation or gender or whatever you want, and P is the reference population, then the group G is diverse in a representative sense to the extent that the distribution of A in G is also similar to that in P. So let me give you an example to illustrate this idea. So if A is ethnicity, for example, and suppose G is an engineering faculty at a university, and P is recent PhDs in engineering, then the group might be said to be ethnically diverse if the distribution of ethnicities in this university faculty is similar to the distribution in the recent PhDs from engineering. I think this is a pretty common way also for people to use to talk about diversity. It's also interesting just to think of the logic of the relationship between egalitarian and representative concepts. So the first thing to notice is that they coincide only when the attribute is uniformly distributed in the reference population. And that might seem unusual, but in fact, there's actually a really significant example where that's sort of approximated, and that's discussions of gender diversity. So for example, gender diversity in science. So these typically treat gender as binary and assume that roughly equal proportions of males and females are present in the general population. And so in this case, representative and egalitarian diversity will basically just boil down to the same thing. But of course, it's important to notice that in most cases, representative and egalitarian diversity will not coincide. So for example, in the case of religious affiliation, it would be very unusual to have a reference population where all of the possible religions are represented in equal proportions. Finally, normic diversity. And this is the idea that a group is diverse to the extent that its members diverge from an assumed non-diverse norm. So to put it formally, if A is the attribute, then a key feature of normic diversity concepts is they're going to pick out one of these categories from A1 through AN and label this as the non-diverse norm. So for example, in the Vaisakhi case, where A was religious affiliation, then Christian would be the non-diverse norm with respect to Canada. So then a group is going to be diverse in the normic sense with respect to this reference population to the extent that few individuals in this group fall into this non-diverse category. And so the Vaisakhi parade is non-diverse in a normic sense. I'm sorry, the Vaisakhi parade would be diverse in a normic sense because most of the people there diverge from the non-diverse norm. Okay. And there's a number of interesting comparisons, contrasts between normic diversity and egalitarian diversity. And one of the most obvious ones is that for normic diversity, it can make sense to talk about a single person as being diverse, which is absurd from an egalitarian standpoint. And one way to actually find people using this concept is just Google, like, can a single person be diverse? And you'll find all kinds of arguments about whether that's possible. And what people are basically arguing is whether normic diversity is a legitimate way to think about diversity. But I think it's interesting enough just to take this concept and see where it leads us. Okay, so if we think about these different concepts of diversity that I've specified, we can start to categorize them and see some similarities and differences that they have. So on the one hand, we have within group concepts. And these are concepts of diversity where the diversity of a group is solely determined by the distribution of the relevant attributes within that group. To know whether it's diverse and how diverse it is, that's all you need to look at. Comparative concepts, by contrast, depend not only on the distribution of attributes within that group, but also a comparison to a reference population. So egalitarian diversity is within group, and in fact, so would the two other diversity concepts by Harrison and Klein, that were the disparity and separation. Those would also be within group, although I didn't talk about those much. In contrast to representative and normic concepts, which depend on a comparison to a reference class. And so one of the key things to notice is that for comparative concepts, the reference population that's chosen is a key part of the context. And if you change the reference population, then that can change the assessment of diversity. And this diagram sort of represents the relationships between these different concepts. So if we see here, this is on the far left, a context, and this is including some choice of attributes, a similarity weighting if you're going to include that. And then we've got the group distribution, which is going to obviously be related to which attributes are relevant, and over here, reference population. And then the next sort of dotted area, we see concepts. So within group concepts over here, they only depend on the group distribution. In comparison, comparative concepts depend both on the group distribution and your choice of reference population. And then here, egalitarian diversity falls in with the in-groups, and these two, representative and normic, are comparative. And then measures over here would quantify these different concepts. And I want to emphasize that the three concepts I've specified, the egalitarian, normic, and representative, definitely do not exhaust all the possible diversity concepts. So here's a number of ways you could generate more concepts. One is by adding a similarity weighting. So similarity weighting would basically represent the idea that some categories are more different from each other than others. So for instance, you might think a group consisting of, say, Christians and Jews is less diverse than a group composed of Christians and Sikhs, because Sikhism and Christianity are more different from each other than Christianity and Judaism. So that would be an example where there's some notion not only that they're different groups, but that the degree of difference between the groups matters to how diverse the group is. In addition, concepts can be combined with each other, say representative and normic, for example, and the example of deliberative mini-publics I'll talk about at the end illustrates this point. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to how these different concepts of diversity matter for thinking about diversity in science. So the first point is that all three of these concepts can be found in discussions of diversity in science: egalitarian, normic, and representative. So they can be found in philosophical discussions of diversity in science. They can be found in explanations of the effect of diversity on group performance. And the distinctions among these concepts are important because they're often associated with distinct epistemic and ethical rationales for why diversity matters, and because a failure to attend to these differences can lead to unjustified inferences. So I'll explain how this works in just a bit right now. So So let's begin with what we call perspective difference explanations. And these are explanations that tend to be associated with egalitarian diversity concepts. And here the idea is that diversity is beneficial because when a group is required to carry out some task that's complex and requires innovation to achieve successfully, then it's often very difficult to be sure or to make sure that you've covered all the bases in terms of analyzing the set of possible solutions. It's always very easy to overlook some really important possible option that will be, superior to other things you could have done. And so there's quite a number of explanations and arguments about the value of diversity that really focus on that idea that by having a bunch of different perspectives, heuristics, different experiences, different information, people with different educational backgrounds and so on, that this will lead to a wider range of options and theoretical viewpoints, et cetera, being explored, and the creation of sort of novel solutions that might not otherwise have been appreciated, and that will lead to a superior result. And so I think this is probably the most common epistemic rationale for diversity. And it's clear that this kind of explanation relies on a within group diversity concept, because you have to have diversity or variation within the group. And typically these are going to be egalitarian, or in some cases weighted egalitarian explanations. So for example, Hong and Page, if some of you are familiar with their work, they use a kind of weighted egalitarian measure when they're deciding when they're measuring diversity within their model. Okay. All right. So what about normic diversity then? Well, it turns out normic diversity will tend to be associated with a very different type of explanation about the epistemic benefits of diversity. Now, first of all, unlike egalitarian diversity, normic diversity tends to be much less likely to be explicitly stated. And in fact, in terms of social science work, I don't really know any social scientists who explicitly state that they're using a normic diversity concept, although there definitely are examples of people who are using it. And so if you want to find normic diversity in use in social science or other places, oftentimes you have to have a way to do it. But there's an easy trick to find it, and that is to look for the diverse person idiom. Because remember that according to egalitarian diversity, it doesn't make any sense to call a single person diverse, because of course a single person couldn't have any variety with respect to the attribute that you're interested in. And so when you hear language like a diverse student, a diverse scientist, that's a hint that this person is likely using diversity in a normic sense. So in this paper, we actually did that. I typed in, diverse scientist, diverse student, and so on, and found a bunch of articles. And here's one of them. I was exploring the potential of using stories about diverse scientists and reflective activities to enrich primary students' images of scientific work. And to verify that, this article was really using a normic diversity concept, it was important, number one, to say, okay, what's the notion of diversity? What's the non-diverse norm? And in this case, they described old white eccentric males of extraordinary intelligence, and this is sort of the non-diverse norm of scientists. And then there has to be some emphasis on a group of people who diverge from this non-diverse norm. And in this case, it was described as females, wheelchair-bound students, or those with other physical challenges, students from non-Caucasian backgrounds, and students who do not consider themselves of superior intelligence. So this seems to me pretty clearly to be using a normic diversity concept. Okay. And another place where I found someone using diversity in a normic sense is in Sandra Harding's book, Objectivity and Diversity, Another Logic of Scientific Research. And Harding writes, what is the diversity on which I focus here? One central concern is to include in scientific decision-making the groups that heretofore have been excluded from participating in decisions about research that has effects on their lives. Sorry. And so here again, you see there's a non-diverse group, which are the sort of the people who have traditionally been sort of in science, and then the people who've been excluded are the diverse people. So again, I think very clearly a normic diversity concept. And these normic diversity concepts tend to be associated with a particular kind of explanation that you might call epistemic advantage explanations. And these are explanations that attribute a kind of epistemic advantage to individuals that fall into the diverse category. And so an example of this type of explanation would be standpoint epistemology, where the idea is that people who are oppressed in an unjust and inequitable society, for example, because of racism, for instance, are more likely to have accurate understandings of the social processes that sort of work to reinforce those inequalities. Of course, there's a lot of caveats about that in standpoint epistemology, but the general idea that there's an epistemic advantage associated with not being the non-diverse person, with being the diverse person. And a related type of explanation that you can find in some social science work is the idea that social sensitivity can improve group performance, and that it's associated with female gender. And here the idea is that males are more socialized to be to be more dominant in their interactions with other people, and this can actually have an adverse effect on how well groups perform when they have to engage in some difficult cognitive task. And so in both of these types of explanations, the idea is not that, oh, when you get a bunch of people who are different and you put them together in a room, you get this sum that's greater, this result that's greater than the sum of the parts. It's rather that, no, there's the people who are diverse have this special sort of cognitive advantage. And so that's really a different type of explanation. So why does this matter for inferences? So here's why this matters, because both of these types of explanations really point to advantages from diversity from different sources. On the one hand, one says it's the variety within the group, and the other one says it's that the diverse people have a special advantage. Or if you thought about it conversely, if you think about what's the deficit of the non-diverse group, for an egalitarian concept, it's typically going to be just homogeneity as a deficit. But for normic diversity, it's going to be homogeneity combined with being sort of socially privileged or socially dominant. And so just to illustrate this idea, a systematic review found that increasing the number of women in work teams was less likely to produce conflict when gender distribution was more balanced. And from this, the authors included that the negative effects of gender diversity are weaker in more gender balanced settings. Now, the thing that's interesting about this, if you look at this, you see the conclusion is not specifically about introducing more women in a predominantly male environment. It's just in general, more gender diversity. And from their work, it's clear that they're using, like most social scientists, using an egalitarian diversity concept. So that means that their conclusion also applies to the case where you had a majority of female members of the organization and you're introducing males. And so their conclusion would also be that if, for instance, you had, say, 90% female and you introduce a few more males to the organization, that's more likely to produce conflict than if it's, say, 40-60 and you introduce a few more males. Now, what's interesting is it's unclear that that really follows from the data that they have, because it's possible that the results they get are not due to homogeneity per se, but due to the fact that males tend to also be a socially dominant or socially privileged group, and that's part of what's driving the effect. And if it were the majority of women, you might not have that effect. And so this is a point to illustrate how the failure to consider these different diversity concepts and the different explanations that are tied to them can result in inferences that aren't really justified by the data. Finally, I'm going to look at representative diversity. So this is a concept you can also find, and this is from a review article about, this quotation is from a review article about work on diversity in science and science fields, and it uses clearly diversity in a representative sense. It says representational diversity, where organizations have workforces that match the pool of degree recipients in relevant fields, is necessary but not sufficient condition for diversity to yield benefits. So again, clearly a representative diversity concept there. Here's another one. This is in relation to journalism. It says there is representative diversity when the political diversity in the communications is representative of the political diversity in the total society. And so here, democratic legitimacy is an obvious rationale for representative diversity, especially like in the journalism case. And it's interesting to think about, well, what's the epistemic rationale, though, for representative diversity? Is there one? And in fact, you can see that it is possible to have an epistemic rationale for representative diversity. And this can often happen when the distribution of viewpoints is sort of driven by evidence. And we see an example like this in relation to the objection that journalists sometimes resort to this equal time approach to presenting climate change and climate skeptics. And the concern is that, well, in the scientific community, obviously the climate skeptics are this tiny minority. So if you just present them with equal time, then you're giving this sort of misleading view of what the actual scientific opinion is. And excuse me, and that seems sort of a wrong thing to do. And there, the idea is clearly that the views of the scientists are representative or reflective of the state of evidence in the field. Okay, so let's go to the last section of the talk. And in this section, I'm going to talk about a concrete example where these different concepts of diversity, and in particular, the possibility of hybridizing these different concepts is actually really relevant. And it also brings out the ways in which these different concepts create sort of ethical, epistemic sort of choices that need to be made in a sort of concrete situation. So first of all, deliberative mini-publics are events in which members are recruited to learn about a policy issue, they discuss that issue among themselves, and then they provide input to a decision-making process. And the deliberative mini-publics I'm going to talk about briefly here are all examples of, or all dealt with the topic of human tissue biobanking within British Columbia. And one of the co-PIs on this project, Michael Burgess, was involved in those deliberative mini-publics. So if you read literature about deliberative mini-publics, it's almost every paper will say something about diversity being this really valuable thing, and that one of the main goals of these events is to get or to elicit a diverse array of opinion from the public. And given the link between representative diversity and democratic legitimacy, it's natural to interpret diversity in a representative sense in this context. That would be a natural place to start. But in fact, the actual story is a little bit more complex than that. So let's look at how that's so. So here's a quotation from a paper by Gooden and Dryzek that's discussing what does diversity mean in deliberative mini-publics. And they say, we will be focusing on mini-publics with some claim to representativeness of the public at large. By some claim, we do not mean statistical representativeness, which only one design, the deliberative poll, explicitly asserts. All some claim to representativeness need mean is that the diversity of social characteristics and plurality of initial points of view in the larger society are substantially present in the deliberating mini-public. Social characterizations and viewpoints need not be present in the same proportion as the larger population. So in other words, the idea is that the same categories, like the same, say, ethnicities perhaps, or the same viewpoints should be present, that are present in the reference population, should also be present in the deliberative mini-public, but not necessarily in the same proportions. Okay. And this creates a possibility for a sort of representative normic hybrid. And I'll just give you a few examples of this. So here the idea is that the distribution of attribute categories is similar in the reference population, except that proportions of certain marginalized or discriminated against groups are higher in the mini-public. And here's an example of this from a paper. I'm not going to read the whole quote, just in the interest of time. But the idea is that in this mini-public, and this is one of the mini-publics that was done on the topic of human tissue biobanking in BC. The idea was that they began with sort of proportions of groups according to the Canadian census, and then they raised the proportions of some groups, particularly Indigenous people and individuals with genetic or chronic disabilities. They raised their proportions to be higher in the mini-public than they would be in the general population of British Columbia. And the key idea, as they say here, was to ensure that these voices would be present on a topic, potentially able to affect them in a disproportionate manner. So here the idea is if there's some groups whose input are likely to be especially important because they might have special insights or because they're likely to be affected more than other people, then it makes sense to include them in a sort of in a greater proportion than they would be in the population. Okay. So recognizing distinct diversity concepts then is important in this case because it can contribute to greater clarity about what's meant by diversity. And the papers on this subject of diversity and deliberative mini-publics almost never explain what they mean by this term. It also highlights the distinct ethical and epistemic rationales that may be relevant for deciding which concept to use. And it allows this to be sort of brought out into the open and to have that discussion. And I think that's a really important thing to do. Okay, so wrapping up then. In this work, we distinguish 3 diversity concepts: egalitarian, normic, and representative. And we claim the following things: that you can find all 3 of these concepts embedded in discussions about diversity in science, and including and philosophical discussions on this topic. You can also identify distinct ethical and epistemic rationales that tend to be associated with these. So again, to sum that up, the egalitarian tend to be associated with these sort of perspective difference explanation. Normic tend to be associated with epistemic advantage explanations, and representative when they're associated either with democratic legitimacy, and sometimes also with the idea that there's a distribution in a population of experts, for example, that reflects what the evidence suggests. And finally, since all 3 concepts have not previously, prior to our work on this topic, which is now a few years old, but since this had not previously been jointly considered, the idea that you could hybridize these different concepts then wasn't considered either. But then, as we saw in the example about deliberative mini-publics, this is not only something that can be useful, but it's something that people actually do. All right, so with that, that's, oops, one last point, sorry. Yes, and the case of deliberative mini-public suggests there can be ethical epistemic reasons for adopting hybrid diversity concepts. All right, so with that, I'll wrap up, and I'll be happy to answer any questions people might have. And that's just the references, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, so we'll have, yeah, I'll take questions through the chat. I think we're supposed to have a break at around 4:15, but I'll bump that down so that we have like about 10 or so minutes for questions.
So I see somebody says, can you explain more about the hybrid models? Yeah, so the hybrid models are basically combining 2 or more of these different diversity concepts. So I think the most common combination is that I've encountered is the one that I mentioned about representative and normic. And so there the idea is that you have a distribution, let's say, of individuals recruited to a deliberative mini-public, and you have a distribution, you aim for a distribution that's representative, as judged, for example, by census data, with respect to some key demographic categories. But at the same time, you also adjust that distribution to increase the representation of certain groups, typically groups that are sort of marginalized or discriminated against in some way, and whose input is relevant to the topic at hand. And so I think that's actually, something that, again, I know a few examples where people do this, and there's a sort of fairly straightforward rationale for doing it. But I think without having distinguished these different concepts and the rationales that are associated with them, it can be a little hard to understand what does that have to do with diversity, and how is this a diversity concept, and so on. And so I think being clear about these different concepts and the rationales they tend to be associated with can be really helpful for understanding what's going on in a case like that.
So Shrikar Patel asked a question. I think it was directly to me. He asked, so normic diversity is something far from the status quo, as opposed to diverse in the context of the population at large?
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, so again, think about that Vaisakhi example. So the key idea to understand the difference between normic and egalitarian, where egalitarian tends to be, certainly in social science, far and away the most common way people think about diversity. I think in popular, just ordinary discussion, normic concepts are actually really common. But in social science research, it's just almost, egalitarian diversity is the way people think about it in the majority of cases. But to see the idea, think about an example like this. Think about a group of, let's say, Black transgender woman. Now this group is going, and imagine the group is entirely composed of people who fall into those categories. From an egalitarian standpoint, this group is not diverse because everybody has the same sort of relevant features, right? But from the point of view of normic diversity, they are diverse. And that's the key difference. The idea is that they're diverse because they all differ from the non-diverse norm. Um, and if any of you are ever read work by Audre Lorde, I found a paper for recently, which I didn't know about when we wrote this paper back in 2018, but she refers to the same idea as the mythical norm of, like, you know, so the white straight male who's upper middle class or whatever is this sort of mythical normal person, and people are diverse when they're sort of different from that thing, and versus having a variety of different features within the group. Does that make sense to people? Is that helpful? Okay, so I'm seeing a bunch of the questions on the chat. Did you want me to respond to them, Arians, or did you want to read them out?
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah, if you like to.
Okay, so let me see. I'm just going to read in the order that I see them appearing. So I see one that says, I'm interested in the measures. The examples all seem to assume a binary measure or an ordering on a single dimension. Is there a rationale for not? Oh, yeah, so I mean, are you thinking about, what about measures for cases where we have multiple multiple characteristics at once? Yeah, I didn't talk about, there definitely are measures for that. I'm more of a philosopher and less of a technical kind of person, so I'm not, you know, the best person to ask about the technical details of those types of measures, but there certainly are measures for that. In that paper by Teachman that I cited early in the talk, Teachman begins by discussing measures that apply when you only have one attribute category, like, you know, religious affiliation, and then he goes on to discuss ones in which you have, say, you know, as many different categories as you want. And then there's also discussions about whether it's a discrete category versus a continuous variable. And so there's many different measures for, like, these different types of cases. In terms of something like the egalitarian diversity, the concept though would be roughly the same. I mean, if you had, let's say, you know, three different attributes, the idea would be a uniform distribution over all the intersections of those attributes, right? Would be the maximum of diversity, and the more focused it is on one, you know, intersection of those three attributes, the less diverse it would be. But it's easier to sort of conceptualize the idea when you think about one attribute at a time, which is why I explain it that way. Okay. Is that good? I'll go on to the next question that I'm seeing, which says, at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned the Sikh festival. Would you please further explain why this festival would be considered diverse? Yeah, so it could be considered diverse or not diverse, depending on which concept of diversity you had, which was the way this example, the purpose I was trying to use this example. And it's really that insight was sort of what led to this project. So it could be considered not diverse if you took an egalitarian sense, because if the relevant attribute is really religious affiliation, then almost everyone at this event is of the same religion, and so it's not diverse in that way. On the other hand, if you take a normative conception, where in Canada, I think pretty straightforwardly, Christian would be the non-diverse norm with regard to religion, then this event is diverse because pretty much everybody there is of a religion that's very different from Christianity. And so it seems like that's diverse. Does that make sense? Let's see, what about, and look at the next question. Why do you think using a concept of normic diversity isn't explicitly articulating the view, what they mean by diversity? So I'm trying to understand this question. Are those using other concepts of diversity more explicit? Oh, why do you think they aren't using this? Well, geez, that's a good question. Why do people tend not to be as explicit about this concept as they are about egalitarian diversity? That's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to that question. I can speculate and guess. One of the things that's interesting is that if you look at that Teachman paper, which was sort of, again, one of the first papers I know that really addresses this question of what is diversity and how do you measure it with regard to people. That paper is published in 1980. And if you think what was going on around that time, in 1978, was the date of the Bakke versus Regents of the University of California, which for any of you who's interested in diversity is a court case you should really know about. I mean, this is the one where Justice Lewis Powell, in his majority opinion, said that affirmative action can be justified on the basis of promoting a diverse student body and thereby enhancing education through the benefits of diversity, but it can't be justified by remediating discrimination. That can't be a justification for affirmative action. And so that decision led to a huge amount of research in academia about the benefits of diversity for promoting education, for promoting results in groups and all kinds of things. And if you think about the concept of diversity that's behind Lewis Powell's judge decision, it's that it's clearly a kind of within group perspective difference notion, right? The idea is that if you have a bunch of different outlooks around, they all sort of mix together, somehow you get this result that's greater than the sum of the parts. That's clearly this sort of egalitarian within group diversity kind of thinking. So it's not surprising that when people who are influenced by that decision, when they started to think about how do we measure diversity, they were thinking about diversity in that sense. And I think that just became the dominant way to think about diversity. Now, the normative diversity is one that people use a lot in ordinary life, but in the sort of official concepts of diversity that were developed in science and social science, they were really the egalitarian stripe by and large. So that's my speculation, but that's a bit of speculation, so I wouldn't put too much on that. And I'm not sure if there are any other questions out there. I've answered all the ones that I saw on the chat.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly say, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to follow up. For people who have questions, that's totally okay.
Yeah. Oh, I see another one. Someone posted another question. So it says about the normative model. What if there is no homogeneous norm against which to measure diversity? Okay, that's a great question. Imagine we had diversified and egalitarian, say, in science. Yeah, so this is a great question. So this would be, so in a way, this is a really interesting question because what it points out is that when you think about normative diversity, you're automatically thinking about a society that is not equal. You're thinking about a society that has inequalities, inequities, and injustices in it. And if you lived in a society that was a sort of utopia, a sort of multicultural utopia where there's different cultures, different religions, all this kind of stuff, but everybody's equal and there's no discrimination, right? That would be a society where you could have egalitarian diversity, but you couldn't have normative diversity, right? And now, of course, that would be a utopia. It's probably not a world that will ever exist. I mean, hopefully we can get closer to that world in some ways, but it's not a world that's likely to exist anytime soon. But it's interesting to realize that point because it makes you realize that people can think about diversity, believe in diversity, and believe that diversity is beneficial and be totally oblivious or even in denial about the existence of inequalities in the world, right? Because they could believe the world is like this utopia where there are different cultures and different people, different backgrounds, but really everybody's equal and nobody experiences discrimination. You could have that belief. And I think there's probably some people who do have that kind of belief. And in fact, there's even some of the really famous work in diversity, like for example, like Hong and Page, if you look at their model is really a model of, to answer this question, why would you choose people who are sort of diverse versus just choosing people who are the best individually? So in other words, why value diversity instead of just go with pure meritocracy? And that kind of suggests that the reason why you don't have diversity, say in a board of directors or in a university faculty, is just meritocracy. It's not some kind of injustice or unfairness or something. And and I don't mean to say that Hong and Page were supporting this kind of view, but if you were to take that model as sort of the explanation of how to think about diversity, then it kind of encourages that a little bit, right? So I think it's interesting to note this because, and this might go back to this other question of why is the normative concept of diversity sort of given less academic credibility or something. I mean, this is perhaps one reason because the egalitarian concept is less confrontational. It's one that doesn't say, okay, there's injustices in the world and diversity has to do with that. It just says people are different and we bring different people together and we get this the sum is greater than the parts and isn't that wonderful? And that's a nice story. And that's kind of, again, to go back to the Lewis Powell decision in Bakke, I mean, that's kind of the message of that, right? Don't worry about all these bad things that have happened. Let bygones be bygones, and and so anyway, that might sound a little cynical, but that's one possible reason. Okay, another question. I'm not sure if you mentioned this. Can you speak to the policy implications or possibilities regarding these different definitions of diversity? Yeah, I would say that I think by and large, I think I don't know if there's direct policy implications of these. I think these concepts are useful, for research, certainly for philosophy, philosophical research, I think for social science research. They're useful definitely, I think, in terms of, if you want to think of what are practical applications, I think the case of designing deliberative mini publics and other types of public deliberations, I think they're very helpful for designing those kinds of events in a very thoughtful way that's clear about why you're designing it the way you're designing it. Beyond that, I mean, I think it's relevant in an indirect way, in the sense that it could promote research that might be better, and hopefully that better research might uh, have an effect on policy down the line. I don't think there's a direct effect insofar as if you taught people to think, say, in normic diversity terms, that would change society and make it more equal or something. I don't think that's likely to be the case, but I think the concepts are useful for advancing research. And I think they're also useful for, for thinking about how to design public 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 discourse events like deliberative mini publics.
Arez, do you want to move forward to the next representation, or you want
Yeah,
to
I was
have a
thinking to
break?
take let's take like a 5-minute break, and then when we return, we'll start with our next speaker. Thank you. All right, so it's been 5 minutes, and now it's time for our next talk. Because of the time discrepancy, you'll have it until about 5:30, 5:40, and then 10 minutes for discussion. So this will end maybe around 6 o'clock, just a little bit over, but it's our first time and on Zoom, no less. So yeah, working with what we got. Okay, so it's time for our second talk of the day. Our second speaker is Dr. Sina Fazlpour. Currently, he is a postdoc fellow at Carnegie Mellon's University's philosophy department and machine learning department, and a fellow of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council. His research interests or research areas are in the philosophy of science, cognitive science, and the ethics of artificial intelligence and data science. Dr. Fazlpour has authored many articles published in top journals. He has recently been commissioned by the Journal of Philosophy Compass to write a paper on algorithmic bias. His talk today is titled Diversity, Trust, and Conformity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sina Fazlpour.
Thanks, Arens, and thanks all the organizers. This is such a great workshop, and I'm so happy to be able to join you. First, let's see whether I can share my screen. Okay. All right, so well, thanks for having me. This paper, similar to Dan's paper that he was talking about, this is also a joint work with Dan. And unlike the paper that Dan was discussing, where our focus was on different senses of diversity and different concepts of diversity and the implications of that for how we measure diversity and think about it and draw inferences, the focus of my talk will be on epistemic consequences of diversity. So you probably, if you just search news, you will see a lot of the documents, and in philosophy, we have a lot of discussion of that, about how diversity can create teams that are in some sense better, that perform better. Of course, we all know the discussions of diversity, how it's important for reasons of fairness and justice, equity. But there's this idea that diversity can also lead to better teams, right? So that diverse teams are somehow smarter, or they create a better workforce. And in somehow, so some of the other work that I do, there's this idea that when a field or maybe a design team lacks diversity, the product that they create is more likely to malfunction in some way. So there's calls in AI for creating more diverse teams, because the idea is that that will lead to better design teams. So this topic of epistemic impact of diversity, of course, has been studied by researchers across many different fields: philosophy, organizational research, social psychology, computational sociology, and so on. And the line of research that I want to focus on in the talk today is the group of researchers that use formal tools. So these are analytical tools or computational simulation tools to study this question, to see how diversity impacts group performance. Now, of course, many of the things that I will say will hopefully generalize beyond the discussions of formal models of diversity. But I think this is nice for focusing our attention to specific pathways by which diversity can be beneficial to groups. Now, there are many different formal models of diversity. As I said, there are in many different fields. But a core idea that is underlying many of these models is that diversity, especially understood as heterogeneity of cognitive repertoires, these are things like task-relevant information that somebody might have, ways of learning that people might have, their different perspective, different problem-solving approaches, and so on and so forth, are beneficial because this would allow a group, a diverse group, to deal with the demands of exploration and exploitation. That is, not only can they use the best approaches that are, or approaches that are currently seen to be the best approaches. But if something unexpected comes, they can also explore other alternatives. So there's somebody in the group that might have an idea about how to solve a problem that other people have not encountered before, for instance, or might have a piece of information or a perspective that is better at dealing with certain novel situations. So what underlines this thing, the main point is that there's this cognitive notion of diversity, this cognitive repertoires. Nonetheless, these models have been very influential in social discussions or public debates about consequential social policies like affirmative action. So these are the discussions of, I'm focusing on Hung and Page's model because I know that some of you have been discussing them before. So in discussions of Hung and Page's model, for instance, as you can see here, the public discourse around the results of the model connects the results to debates about affirmative action. So it's been taken, even though it's about cognitive diversity, it's been taken to say something about demographic diversity, about policies that aim to increase demographic diversity. And similarly with other things. Now the idea that greater diversity isn't just a moral imperative. Again, connecting this idea of cognitive diversity or findings about cognitive diversity to a domain where we are talking about demographic diversity. And these things are more general. This paper by Grimm and colleagues does a nicely summarizes some of these social impact of Hung and Page's model, for instance, but more generally in simulation studies of diversity, and shows how even though these simulations are mainly about the impact of cognitive diversity, their results have been taken as evidence for the benefits of increasing underrepresented groups, that is demographically underrepresented groups. For research and design teams, how they can be epistemically better in support of social policies like affirmative action, or in legal discussions for promoting diversity in different sectors, for instance, armed forces. So this kind of raises a question for us. Given that the social interest in diversity is about demographic diversity, to what extent can we rely on these models and what they say about demographic diversity, given that their main aim or their main focus is really to investigate and explore the impact of cognitive diversity? So when we look at Page, for instance, Page's idea is that for cognitive diversity to produce a bonus, that is to enhance team performance, for instance, it must be germane to the task. It must be task relevant. The same logic applies to identity diversity. So what Page is saying here is that identity diversity, in order for it to be beneficial for the group, it must have some sort of task relevant benefit to the group. That is, individuals, it's not just that you come, let's say here, the example is that you come as a woman to the group, and just in virtue of being woman, you make the group better. Rather, you have to bring some sort of task-relevant information. So the example here is the knowledge, information, models, heuristics. So for identity diversity to benefit the group, it must produce some cognitive diversity. And not only that, so Hung and Page's model, if you look at that, even when they suggest identity diversity correlates or causes functional diversity, which is the term that they use that I'm currently using as cognitive diversity, they suggest that we need to be acutely aware that identity diverse groups often have more conflict, more problems with communication, and less mutual respect and trust among members. This suggests a kind of a double-edged sword view of diversity. The view that demographic diversity can be beneficial to group performance, but only if it can actually enhance cognitive diversity of groups, only if individuals bring something that is task relevant to the group. On the other hand, the idea, as the previous quote by Hung and Page shows, demographic diversity can actually be detrimental to the group. That is, if we keep this pathway fixed through cognitive diversity, demographic diversity can result in a lack of trust and polarization and undermine group cohesion, which is important for group performance, which means that through this pathway, demographic diversity will undermine group performance. So what I wanted to talk about today, so the topic is like, is this true? Is it really true that the only way by which demographic diversity can enhance and benefit group performance is through cognitive diversity? Or is it possible that demographic diversity can have other beneficial, epistemically beneficial impacts for the group, even independently of the task relevant attributes of group members? So the suggestion that we provide in this paper is that, yes, it's possible. And we create a model to answer this question. The model is motivated by psychological literature that I will discuss. And this literature basically shows the benefits of diversity through the cost that homogeneity might have. And I will talk more about that. Then I will talk about how we formalize some of the suggestions that are there in this psychological literature. And through two simulations, I show how demographic diversity can be beneficial to the groups, even independent of cognitive diversity. So how can this happen? A nice way to get into what can go wrong in homogeneous groups is by thinking about conformity. So we are human beings in many groups. When we are there, we are under group influences. And sometimes these are summed up under phenomena of conformity. So generally, people put it in terms of a change in belief or behavior that is in response to real or imagined group influences. Even sometimes the group might not care about me, but if I imagine that they care about me, I might change my belief or behavior response to them. So one early experiment on conformity comes from Ash. And this is a short clip that I hope that it works.
The Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example,
the actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1. 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3. 3.
3.
The Ash experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again.
Yeah, so as you can see, the way that the group behaves and the way that the group acts can really change what the individual, at least publicly, they say. But notice that I say publicly, because as later work on the conformity showed, there are different mechanisms that might be implied in conformist behavior and conformist public behavior that we see. And so one useful distinction, early distinction, was provided by Deutsch and Gerard. So one type of conformity influence that they talk about is what they call informational influences. In a general sense, you can think about it as the sort of thing that is motivated by our desire as individuals to be right, especially when the world is complicated and a task that we are dealing with is ambiguous and difficult. And I'm not too sure about how the task works. I want to be right about, get the word right, and therefore I might rely on what other people are telling me. I might rely on them as sources of information about the world. And given that I'm not sure about how things are, this type of influence impacts my learning and belief. That is, I might internalize groups' information that they provide to me. And the outcome is a change in belief. And of course, based on this setting, you can imagine different types of modifiers for this effect. That is, If the task is more difficult, I am more susceptible to this type of influences. If I am more uncertain or I don't think I am an expert in this task, I might defer to others more often. And similarly, if I see certain other people, depending on their expertise, and as we will see, depending on their background, as more of an expert about a task, I might defer to them even more. Another type of influence that arises in group settings is normative influences. This is, I think, more in line with our general ideas about what we think conformity is, which has to do with the kind of reward and punishment power of the group, so to speak. It's sometimes colloquially you can think about it as it's based on our desire to be liked, or at least not punished by our group. So we don't want to act in a way that diverges from a kind of normative expectations in our groups. And this, of course, impacts our decision-making as opposed to learning per se, because here I might have a particular belief about something, but nonetheless, because I want to be liked by my group, I might not voice that belief. I might not pursue it, right? I might act in conformity with others so that either they like me or they don't punish me. And again, the modifiers here are quite different. Here, the modifiers are something like the group's reward and punishment power, or my desire as an agent that is in this group to belong to that group, or other sorts of rewards. So I might have the task might be so rewarding that I say, okay, whatever, the conformity doesn't matter, and I will try to do as best as I can on the task. So there are these two types of influences. And notice that the notion of the group is different between them. In the informational influences, group is basically anything that can be counted as a source about the world, a source of information about my environment or about the task. Whereas in the normative influences, the notion of group is really about the group to which I want to belong. And that already suggests a possibility for a third type of influence. And this is something that Turner and colleagues in their later work they found out, that there's another type of influence that is similar to the conjunction of these two, so to speak, or the intersection of them, whereby similar to informational influences, it has to do with me relying on others as sources of information about some task, but similar to kind of normative influences to some degree, I take others kind of their visible similarity to me as heuristic, that they're more reliable about the task. Now, most of these results, of course, if you ask people that, do you think people your in-group or people from the same demographic as you are more reliable about the task, they probably will say no. But most of the psychological experiment shows that their behavior in terms of the way that they go and revise their belief suggests that they give more weight to the testimony of their in-groups. Right? So the idea here is basically that given that I perceive my in-groups to be more epistemically competent, I rely on them more, and I'm more likely to revise my beliefs in light of what they say. So you can already imagine how this relates to the idea of diversity. Research on diversity, psychological research, has shown that diversity can counteract these two types of detrimental impacts of conformity on our behavior. So on the one hand, we have this trust pathway, which is through the referent informational influences. And the idea is that if I'm in a group that is homogeneous and we are all similar, let's say, I don't know, we are all Iranian, and maybe Iranians disagree with each other a lot, but suppose that the Iranians agreed with each other a lot, and so they told me something, I might just take it at face value, right? I might not question it. Uncritically, I might accept it, and I just, I'm not very diligent as an epistemic agent in that group. And the idea is that when the group becomes more diverse, it reduces this type of uncritical acceptance of other people's information. So through that, it might then be beneficial for the group as a whole. And the other way is that through this normative conformity pathway. So here, remember the idea was that because I want to belong to the group, I might worry that if I say something, raise some sort of dissenting opinion or view, the group will dislike it. research shows that diversity can be beneficial here. On the one hand, in diverse groups, individuals feel less conformity pressure, and they're more likely to voice their dissenting views. So they're more likely to contest the opinion of others, and they're more likely also to consider novel views and not get upset. So in light of this, there are experiments that show, for instance, in relation to this also, that if your in-groups disagree with you, people get more upset, whereas if an out-group disagrees with them, they're more okay with it. So in both of these things, you see that the idea is that diversity can counteract certain detrimental things that can happen in homogeneous groups, especially in their communication dynamics, right? So the question is, why can simulations be helpful here? Already I'm telling you these psychological experiments that seem to suggest that diversity can be beneficial in these ways. The issue is that these empirical studies currently, the interpretation of them face a number of challenges. So on the one hand, there's a small sample size, but more fundamentally, there's this worry in these empirical settings that we cannot really disentangle demographic information from cognitive diversity. How can I make sure that these groups that I'm saying that one is homogeneous, the other one is demographically diverse, are actually equal with respect to cognitive diversity, such that any benefit that I see cannot be attributed to that cognitive diversity, if you remember the double-edged sword kind of view. Other issues have to do kind of with long-term impacts of diversity. For instance, just many of these experiments are about the benefits of diversity on individual behavior in group setting. That is, I might, let's say, voice dissenting opinion in a group, in a more diverse group more often than in a homogeneous group. But of course, these things, if you really want to think about group performance, we have to think about cycles of cause and effect, because my behavior then will impact others. In real life, people are not going to be the collaborators of the experimenter, similar to the ASH experiment that we saw, but our actions are going to interact with each other. And therefore, it's important to see what is the emergent outcome of this interacting phenomena. And computational models can help address these challenges because they allow us to think about these hypotheses in kind of idealized settings. And so, for instance, easily we can look at disentangle the impacts of demographic diversity and cognitive diversity, making sure that cognitive diversity is kept fixed. So how do we do this? The setup of the simulation that we have, it's kind of an extension of a model that Kevin Zollman, I think, first introduced in 2007 and then later 2010. Let me start by briefly stating what the model looks like. So in these models, there are groups of agents. Each agent is involved with a two-armed bandit task. So if you're familiar with this, these are computational problems that are used traditionally to study exploration and exploitation dilemma. And the idea is that, think about, imagine that you're this subject. You're facing with two options. You want to see which one is more rewarding. So you might think about them as two coins, one of them, and you want to see which one comes up heads more often. One of them might be biased, for instance. So you do option one, you take 100 trials with that, you toss the coin, let's say 100 times, you see 51 times it's success. For instance, it might be heads. With option B, it might be 49. And the question then is that which option should you pursue next time if you want to make more money? For instance, if you make money through heads. Well, of course, things need not be about money. You can think about it in terms of experimental paradigms, right? You can think about it in terms of efficacy of drugs. In each time, you see certain amount of patients recover due to the drug. You want to decide which one you should actually release into the market, for instance, after this experimental trial is over, or when to stop the experimental trial, the original setting. And the difficulty here is that when these tasks are probabilistic, your limited observations are not going to tell you about the objective payoff functions of these two things. Each time you say you see certain things, for instance, you saw 51 success here and 49 here, even though the objective distribution of the option option B is better than option A. So, but on the limited number of observations that you had, option A seemed better. So that's the kind of exploration dilemma. Should you exploit what seems like the best thing for you now, or should you pursue the other option? And note that the inquiry here is active. If the agent here does not pursue one of the options, they don't get any information about it. We also have social structure. So each agent is involved with that task, but they also have neighbors that are engaging that task too. Some of the neighbors, they have a direct connection to, and when they do have a direct connection, they can send their evidence that they got from their trials to each other. And some of them, so for instance, this neighbor will get information from these three neighbors. And this is, of course, beneficial because even if I pursued option A, one of my neighbors pursued option B, I can still get information about option B, even if I did not myself pursue it. But of course, the danger of it is that if my neighbors are getting quite misleading results, I might get misinformation and pursue the option that looks better right now, even though in the long term, it's not the best option. So in these experiments, we mainly focus on three typical networks. And people look at these things because they have a number of good characteristics. In complete networks, all the agents are connected to each other. So all of us send our evidence to each other. In cycles, each agent has two neighbors. And in wheel, there's one agent with a higher degree of centrality. So we have each agent involved in a task. We have agents receiving information from their social sources. And of course, agents have subjective beliefs about which of the options are better. When they get the evidence, you don't need to think about the details of this here. But basically, they have their prior beliefs about each option. When they get their evidence, they update it. It's kind of their Bayesian agents that they update their beliefs in light of new evidence. And when they do update, all of the agents are greedy in the sense that if I think that option A is better than option B, I will always follow option A. As I said, I might receive information about other options thanks to my neighbors, but our agents in our models, all of them are greedy in the sense that they will always pursue the option with the highest perceived utility. In this first simulation, which has to do with the trust pathway, agents this utility is only a function of truth. But in the second one, we will see that the agents will also care about social approval and disapproval. And that's how we will bring in the normative conformity pressure. Okay, so the first one, the trust pathway. So remember that this referent informational influence, the idea was that it impacts the learning and belief revision of agents. So it's kind of, that is the part of the simulation that we would want to change. And it's modulated by the perceived source reliability. And the idea here was that in group members, so this is like now we have given color to these things to indicate whether they're in or out groups. In groups, members are seen as more competent than out groups. So an easy way to formalize this is to give weighting to the evidence that is arriving from different agents, right? So imagine that I give a weighting of 1 to all the in-groups, and then I define a factor called omega or W to indicate how much weight I give to the evidence that comes from other agents in relation to my in-group agent. So you can think about it as this W or omega going between 0 and 1. If it's 1, it means that I trust out groups in as much as I trust in groups. If it's 0, it means that I don't trust out groups at all. I completely neglect their evidence. So basically, if I want to update my beliefs, I completely ignore what they say. And if it's anything between 0 and 1, you can think about it as some sort of unjustified distrust of out-group members. I call it unjustified because there is no indication why, other than the fact that they're out-groups, they should be lacking in an epistemic sense, right? So given this setting, then we can study how different type of groups will perform. So the type of factors that we vary in this setting are the trust. We look at different levels of trust. We look at different network structures, group size, and group composition. So if it's a group of 10, for instance, you can have 10 in groups, no out groups, 9 in groups, 1 in, out group, and so on and so forth. And the type of dependent variables that is interesting to us. One is the probability of successful learning. So after a number of, so at each time step, agents experiment with one of the options. They send their information to each other, and we repeat this. And the idea is that is the group as a whole successful after a certain amount of time? So I think we do 3,000 experiments. After 3,000 round of experimentation, for instance, is the group as a whole successful? And what we mean by success is that do all the agents currently possess the right belief? That is, if option A is objectively better than option B, is that what all the agents think? And we also look at the speed of convergence. That is, what would happen if you stop the simulation at a lower number of, or higher number of experimentation instead of 3,000? So the first result is about the relation between probability of success and as a function of trust and group size. So let's focus on just one of these things, maybe when there is complete trust. So I don't make any difference between in groups and out groups. So as you might expect, as the number of agents increases, the performance of the group gets better as well. This makes sense, right? Because the more sources of information you have about an uncertain environment, the better it is. But let's focus on one part of things. Let's keep the group size now fixed and see how the changing the trust level impacts the group performance. So maybe, again, unsurprisingly, if the trust between group trust is really low, if I completely ignore the evidence that is coming from the 5 out group members, these are groups of 10 and 5 in groups, 5 out groups. You can reverse, maybe 5 group A, 5 group B makes more sense. If I just ignore the evidence from 5 of my teammates, then of course the performance is not going to be great. And groups in which there is equal levels of trust perform better. But interestingly, relatively within this setup, the particular numbers don't mean much, but relatively high levels of distrust are better than complete trust. So this goes to the idea that we saw in the psychological literature, that too much trust between group members can be detrimental to group performance. And this type of group-based distrust can be beneficial in this way. And now, when we look at this same type of performance metric, but in relation to group composition, we will see that the benefits of diversity are going to increase with the amount of diversity. That is, a group that only has 1 out group members does better. I mean, I don't have here the graph for the completely homogeneous group, but it does better than the homogeneous group. But as we increase the amount of diversity, and this is in the egalitarian sense, as we increase the amount of diversity, the group is performing better and better. And interestingly, this is actually similar to findings that are in the psychological literature. That is, the idea is that the more we have diversity, the better the benefits of diversity, or the more enhanced the benefits of diversity are going to be. Now, when we look at the relation between diversity and trust and network structure, that gives us a hint about why diversity is going to be beneficial in these settings. So one thing that we will see, so the figure here, again, this is the probability of successful learning, and this is the degree of group-based trust. Perfect trust, no trust at all towards outgroups. You will see that, as we saw before, for complete networks where everybody is interacting with everyone else, to a certain extent, a high level of distrust can actually enhance group performance, after which things go down. But for more sparse networks, groups in which not everyone is communicating with everyone else, and that there's a less amount of evidence overall that is being shared, we will see that there's not much benefit to diversity, if at all, right? So things are kind of plateaued, and especially for cycle in which each agent is only in connection with 2 other agents, diversity appears to be detrimental very quickly. It is interesting to see why that is. Why is it that increasing diversity is beneficial for these groups and not the other groups? And here, looking at the relation between performance and trust and speed is going to be instructive. So what you see here is that the reds are complete networks. Everybody interacts with everybody else. And as we saw again, in these complete networks, the dashed one is when there is a high level of distrust, the performance level is higher than the performance when there is complete trust between the 2 groups. But not so for the cycle. And the reason for this is that because in the cycle network, the level of communication is already low, right? There's not a lot of evidence. When we increase the level of distrust, we are basically decreasing the amount of evidence even more. So we are decreasing the speed at which the agents in the cycle networks get to their optimal performance, so to speak, get to the performance level that they can get. And so for this reason, by slowing down the speed of convergence, distrust in cycle networks can be, or generally sparser networks, can be detrimental to the performance of these groups. And kind of the basic idea then is that in complete networks, diversity can be beneficial because there's lots of information going on in these networks. And because there's lots of information going on, groups, it's nice because the speed of convergence in these groups is high, but at the same time, there's potential danger of premature convergence because of misinformation. So if one of our neighbors or one agent in the group randomly gets a result that is very good about the option that is objectively inferior, that result actually travels quickly and widely across the entire network and might mislead all the other agents in the network. Whereas in networks that are sparser, these type of results are kind of quarantined in a small part of the network, and their impact is not as wide. And so people in literature have, of course, this was one of the findings of Kevin Zollman himself, but people have also have seen this in other settings, and they have proposed different types of solutions to it. For instance, some people have suggested that in epistemic communities, we should reduce connectivity to solve this issue. Some people have said that we should increase confidence that we require in others as source of information, or we should only follow norms that would say that we should only share high quality information. But what we see here is that diversity can also be one of the solutions here. And what it does is that it increases the critical uptake, or if you want, the skeptical uptake of information by other informational sources. It makes the agents less susceptible to premature belief revision, premature changes of belief in light of evidence that might be unreliable. So diversity is here beneficial, even though it's not a priori related to any cognitive diversity. All the agents share the same cognitive repertoire, so to speak. And it's subject to the typical trade-offs that, as we saw, that of course it's beneficial, but it brings the speed down, and so on and so forth. So the second experiment, diversity and conformity, I don't have much time about this, but let me just quickly go through it. So this one was about, maybe actually we can come back to this because it's nicer to have a discussion. Then there are lots of nice colors. If it's one thing that you can to take away from it, it's a very colorful figure. We can think about it later. So the general idea is that even independently of cognitive diversity, demographic diversity can benefit group performance. And so in that way, it provides support for the empirical hypothesis that we saw in the beginning. And I want to also, like in any simulation, I want to be explicit about the limitations of the model. There are many idealizations and abstractions in the model, similar to many things, not just similar to simulations, but similar to experimental studies that we try to create. Some of these idealization and abstractions are easier to relax and include in the model, and some are more difficult. And these include things like the impact of factors like status or power on the behavior between agents. This is something that I did not take into account. Another thing that I think is quite interesting is quite interesting for follow-up is neglect of structural interactions in our model. So for instance, in the model, the interaction between trust and group composition and individual performance is just completely neglected. Even though you might think that if I'm in a group that everybody distrusts me, so I am part of one group, one demographic, and everybody else is from another demographic, if I'm part of this team, I might just leave it. So it might change the group composition, right? But we are assuming that this doesn't happen. Or similarly, if I'm part of a team that's everybody distrusts me, this might impact my performance. But again, we are assuming that this doesn't happen. But nonetheless, I think this nicely captures certain parts of the empirical studies that we wanted to see, especially given that those were the hypotheses that they wanted to check. But I think this also raises an important issue in terms of the social uptake of simulation studies. For instance, the result of the Hung and Page that we saw in the beginning. So Hung and Page's results, in their model, there is really no interaction between agents in a deep way. There's no communication between the agents. Typically, the interaction that there is in their model involves one agent getting stuck at some point of solving a problem, in which case the next agent will come and resume the task from that point. But we see that when we add a little bit more detail about how the communication works in social groups, and the detrimental impact of conformity in these type of groups, in the communication dynamics of these groups, we see that we have to be careful about those models that neglect these things. And our model can be, you can think about it as highlighting the importance of mechanisms that support critical and contestable collective inquiry in communication, so that you don't become less diligent in the way that you interact with others. And but nonetheless, I think simulations can fruitfully complement, and I want to really emphasize the complement part of empirical diversity research. On the one hand, as I showed, they confirm postulated hypotheses in more idealized settings. So they show that, for instance, demographic diversity can be beneficial to groups even independently of cognitive diversity, or even more fine-grained hypotheses about the extent to which demographic diversity can be beneficial. And they can also generate novel hypotheses. So for instance, I haven't seen any, or there is no work looking at the relation between demographic diversity, trust, and sparsity in networks. And this is one thing, work that I'm pursuing right now in digital communities, seeing how taking sparsity, network sparsity into account, that can change the way that we, the benefits of diversity that we find in empirical or real life communities, if digital is real life, which I think nowadays it is. Anyways, thanks, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Oh, I can also bring my desk down slowly. This will look a little bit weird, but it's okay.
Okay, so there's a question in the chat. Emma Obermeyer asked, thank you for this, or said, thank you for this interesting talk. I am wondering whether there is any evidence that the epistemic benefits of diversity in groups vary between different kinds of groups, scientists versus workplace of a company.
That's a great question. It's a very difficult question because there are so many things about the task that is vary between the two things. So you might think that scientists, in a certain sense, for one scientific team, we need a certain level of specialization so that we can even actually talk to each other. Whereas for a certain workplace company, the cognitive diversity part, we can be more lax about it. I don't, like, to my mind, I should say at this point, I don't think I have seen any study. There might be something out there, but I haven't seen anything that looks at comparison between effect of demographic diversity in science versus, let's say, a design team or a business company. I think partly because the task demands are going to be very crucial in the way that diversity interacts with collective performance here. And it would be difficult to make sure that we're keeping all those things fixed throughout these settings. But I don't know, if something comes to my mind, I will mention it. Am I aware of any institution?
Okay, so not sure how to pronounce their name. Xiao Marie Alejandro asked, nice talk. Are you aware of any institution that actually take advantage or uses correctly the demographics diversity in their research groups?
Am I aware of, am I going to give a very pessimistic answer? Well, let's give like my honest opinion. I am aware of many institutions that try to do this and genuinely try to do this. I think there are institutions, I forgot where this paper is, but it might be MIT research teams or something else, that they were trying to employ this thing. And I think they did it for a decade. I can later check this reference and send it to you. That they look at, they had this Freudian scale. I know some philosophers suddenly look, what? Actually, sorry, it was Jungian scale of creativity. And they used it to actually decide the extent to which people are cognitively diverse. So it wasn't demographic diversity. And that's how they created their design teams. And it turned out actually their design team won a bunch of challenges. So it seemed that they created a good research team based on cognitive diversity, but it's not demographic diversity. I think many institutions think that demographic diversity at a larger scale creates a better campus or better program, but I don't know whether they actually have gone as far as trying to really employ that in their research groups. But maybe that's what we should do. That's the hope. So Douglas, did you consider using task difficulty? Okay. Yes. So we use the task difficulty as a or Aidan, sorry, is that Aidan is the first name? Yeah. So we use task difficulty. That's a very good question. We use task difficulty as an independent variable too. And of course, task difficulty in both cases is going to be important. In the first case, with respect to trust, the impact of diversity is going to be dependent on task difficulty because it's precisely when I'm using task difficulty as precisely as you put it, as the closeness between the objective probabilities of the two arms of the bandit, so to speak. And when the task is very easy, you might think the more communication, the better, right? Because there is less chance of misleading results. It's precisely when the task is difficult, when the difference between the probabilities of the payoff of the two arms is low, that I might get misleading results, that I might pursue the wrong arm. And so it's exactly in settings where the task is difficult that diversity is going to be beneficial there, right? So that's one of the things that we did. I don't think we show the result in this paper given the page limit or word limit of philosophy of science, but yeah, so task difficulty is key. And similarly for the conformity experiment, I didn't go through it, but again, task difficulty there, you can think about it as if the task is easy and I know the right answer, then it's the impact of other people's, the impact of diversity in particular, going to be less pronounced. What are some measures of epistemic diversity initiative for evaluating success of solution, approach, or strategy? So could you clarify what you mean by measures of epistemic diversity initiatives? I also like the fact that I'm kind of like, seems like I'm the person that is very aware of all the initiatives in all the universities. I should say that I'm not. There are lots of initiatives going in lots of universities that I don't know about them. But could you, Forte, say a little bit about what you mean by measures of epistemic diversity initiatives? You mean to track progress, for instance, like a university? Well, there are different type of things that people look at. Sometimes in the academic setting, they look at publications, they look at citation records, they look at all the typical things that they look at when they want to see whether research has progressed. Of course, all of those measures, each one of them by themselves, you might think that it's not a fantastic thing, and you might think that they might confound different things. So citation records, for instance, are kind of like a little bit tricky. Yeah, you might get more citation, but is that a really great indicator of progress in terms of epistemic progress? Yes, maybe, but those are the type of things that they look at. The similar type of thing that people look at when they want to rank universities in academic rankings in terms of their research, right?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
There's no follow-up. So I was wondering, so in the case of distrust, I think it was slide 29, I was just wondering if you have like any speculations for what the mechanisms, for like what are the mechanisms there of the distrust? I guess that like originates from the distrust that leads to more like that leads to the success there, I guess, apart from disagreement. Because I know there's like this bit about disagreement, but I'm just wondering of like what other mechanisms are there?
So the great question. The mechanism that I think I went through it too quickly. It's the mechanism that is there is basically a speed of convergence. And distrust, what it does is that it slows down the convergence of the entire group to the wrong option. And notice that if the entire group has converged to the wrong option, then nobody is actually exploring the other option, which especially in the difficult task is going to mislead the entire group. So what happens in that case, and that's why the complete network was particularly the setting that, this is slide 29, that I think is the slide with network structures. And that's why the complete network was the setting that benefited the most from the impact of diversity and so distrust. By kind of reducing the amount of information that agents get from others, it makes them less likely to come to a consensus. It makes the group as a whole less likely to come to a consensus, especially given that the consensus can be a misleading one. So sometimes in these settings, they talk about it in terms of the relation between the speed reliability trade-off. It's a kind of trade-off that exists in certain types of parameter settings. So this will be another, maybe more natural way of bringing that type of trade-off in these groups, complete networks. Are there studies that interrupt this press for convergence and see if there might be an optimal time to break up a Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I think actually Dan, do you remember this? I remember that there might have been something about the length of time where it's good to keep. I have a vague memory of this. The length of time that it's good to keep the diverse groups together, after which they might disagree. So, for instance, if they are interacting with each other for a short amount of time, there might be less effect of disagreements.
So is this, I'm not sure if this is a question about like, sorry, about models, or is it about like
empirical results?
Empirical research. There's definitely like, I mean, I couldn't mention any studies or name any studies off the top of my head, but there's definitely studies on questions like so for example, if you take one of the dynamics and the trust examples that people are, since they're less trustful of people who are of different identity groups, but if people are working together over a long time, they might see them as in their own group, right? They might come to see the group itself as some sort of important identity, right? Because we're all people who work for the same employer or in the same department or something like that. And so the sense of being different from other people in your group could fade over time, right? And that's definitely something that the sort of, I guess, the dissipation of differences among people in a group over time is something that's, that there are empirical studies that discuss this, although I couldn't name them for you off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't remember the empirical studies too, but I had a vague memory that you have both cases. Of course, if we are different from each other, but we are in a group for a long time, then eventually we will be less different from each other, or at least we lose our perception of difference from one perspective. On the other hand, depending on the kind of the culture of inclusion, so to speak, in the group, you might think that the longer we interact with each other, it's more likely that we might get really like polarized. But we kind of completely abstracted away from that type of thing. But it's a very good question about the kind of optimal, so to speak, period of engagement in these groups, after which things might go down, which might be useful for especially juries or things like that, right? Aidan's question is, another one was, skeptical, yeah. I will come back to the follow-up, sorry. But yeah, that's a great question. So right now we had these greedy agents that always follow like greedy Bayesian approach, like always follow the best approach. Is it possible to have a more exploratory agents that once in a while at least go, and there are many different algorithms for them as well, right? So the reason that we just went with the greedy agents in this case, and you're right, that if we change it, it will change some of our results. But the reason was for us just to make sure that there is cognitive homogeneity, so to speak, that there is no cognitive diversity and nothing like that can be driving our approach. But as you note, if the issue, which as I suggested, if the issue is that agents might come to wrong consensus, another way of combating that, of course, is to encourage agents by themselves to think critically. And one way of doing that would be to explore, right? So if you change this to, instead of greedy agents, to epsilon greedy, which is like another reinforcement learning algorithm, then we should see similar type of benefits, right? So yeah, definitely. And this is one thing that we were trying to do at some point, to have both cognitive diversity and identity diversity and see what happens. And we are still in the progress of doing that. But yeah, that's a great point. I'm not familiar with this concept of a skeptical encouragement, but I should learn more about it. Terry.
I'm just learning about it myself, but I love it because I work in groups and groupthink becomes the norm and everyone pats each other on the back and isn't as productive as they should be, or isn't as right? And you create norms within a group. And so I'm wondering if adding new people or new voices to a group to increase the diversity
Mhm.
would disrupt some of that. And so they were playing around this as a epistemological question, right? Of when do we take our own hypotheses and biases too for granted? So um,
Thank you.
I like the phrase too. I was like, seems
Yeah,
relevant.
it's great. I mean, like all the departments do when they bring external reviewers of the department. It's kind of like a skeptical encouragement of the entire attitude of the department.
And
Yeah,
it,
but I like it. It
it
would
worked.
be good to institutionalize that, a skeptical Tuesdays or something, where the entire department becomes great.
All right. Well, yeah, we're kind of nearing the end of our time here. So I don't think there's more time for any more questions, but yeah, I'd like to wrap up by saying thank you so much to our speakers and our participants today. I think this was all a really great discussion, and I hope that you can, or we hope that you can join us at the second workshop on collaborating and strategizing as a minority. And that's on Wednesday, March 10th from 3:30 to about 5. Our keynote speaker for that workshop will be Professor Hannah Rubin from the University of Notre Dame. And we'll also have some special UIC guests as panelists. So we hope you can make it. Stay safe and take it easy in the meantime. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.